Good morning and welcome to Planted in the Word, week 47. And this week marks the week that we make a huge transition. We're transitioning from the Gospels into Acts and some of the Pauline epistles. Those are the letters written by Paul to other parts of the world, specifically in churches that had been planted. But before we get into that, I want to stop and talk about this week's book choices and take a little bit of a step back and see a greater overview. First of all, last week you started with Acts. This week you're going to continue in Acts. And one of the questions we need to consider is, why does Acts go across last week, this week, and I think it's even dispersed into the next few weeks? Well, that is because the book of Acts, thought by most to be written by Luke, and a continuation of Luke's story because it picks up exactly where Luke left off, really covers the disbursement of the church and the beginnings of this new thing, which we'll talk about in a second, across about a 30 to 32 year period. So some people will say it was written between or completed between 40 years. That's up for a little bit of debate, but what we do know is it covers a great deal of time and it covers a great deal of the beginnings, and it lays over the top of some of the other Pauline epistles. That's why we start with Acts, and it's broken up quite a bit. The next book you're going to go into is James. Now, of course, James is what we call him in English, but it really was probably when his mama called him to dinner, she called Jacob or Yaakov as it was. And this is thought to be James, the brother of Jesus. And we see quite a switch in him. He goes from being somewhat maybe of an outsider where it comes to his take on Jesus to being considered the first leader of this new church in Jerusalem, and even thought by most to be a martyr for the faith, which if you consider is based upon his half-brother, is sort of significant. So why do we pivot to James first? Well, James is thought to be, of your New Testament books, the first one written somewhere and completed somewhere between 45 AD. So if we consider that Jesus was taken into heaven approximately 33 plus or minus AD, it's thought that James was completed somewhere between 45 and 50 AD. So James is the most Jewish of all of the books, which is another point that people like to say is one of the reasons why it was probably one of the very first books written. And it is written to the 12 tribes that are beginning to be dispersed. Now, James being completed possibly between 45 and 50 then opens the door for some of our other Pauline epistles. So though I'm presenting them in the way sort of your read through the Bible chronologically presents them also, I will admit that, do we know exactly the order they were written in? No. These three really, James, Galatians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, mostly 1st, are sort of in a pretty tight little clump. James thought to be between 45 and 50 AD, and then Galatians and 1st Thessalonians thought to be written between 50 and 55, if we're giving a big window, but most likely around 52, 53 AD, and pretty close on the heels to each other, so much so that it's about 50-50 that you're going to find people who say, no, Galatians was written first, no, 1st Thessalonians was written first. It doesn't really matter for our purposes other than we're laying foundation as we go forward in these scriptures. So just keep in mind that both as you read Galatians this week and 1st Thessalonians next week, both of these are really groundbreaking, foundation-laying things as it pertains to this new church. So what's going on here? Well, we have really had a cataclysmic shift with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ that has shaken Judaism to its core. And what has come out of this is not a Christian church. Please understand me. What has come out of this is a group of Jews that believe Jesus is Messiah. And from there, this understanding begins to go out through mostly Paul to Gentiles, which then also begin to believe that Jesus was Messiah. It was really traditionally a church movement of Jews, so maybe a synagogue movement that begins to incorporate the world at large, that begins to believe and understand that something significant has happened and that Christianity becomes a path to God, the path to God. Now, they called themselves believers of the way. And the reason that they do that is for two different verses. The first verse, they think that the reason they called themselves is based on Isaiah 40, verse 3. And it talks about, and specifically it says that he came to prepare the way of the Lord. And then in John 14:6, Jesus declares himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. So if we look at those two, that Isaiah passage, Old Testament, Jesus quote, New Testament, you can see how these believers that were sort of threading the needle between this new messianic understanding of Judaism and traditional Judaism would call themselves something unique, the way. So what I would like to point out, and what's going to come up a little bit over and over again, is the struggle that these first century believers had in really opening themselves up to a mind shift. For example, what I'm saying is Paul seems to be butting his head over and over again to believers as he's trying to consistently rein them in the direction of understanding. We used to do it like this. But see, this was a picture of Jesus. And since Jesus came, now we do it like this. We used to organize our worship this way, but because Jesus come and we now have a greater high priest, we don't have to go to a high priest once a year for him to present to God. We can approach, because of Jesus, ourselves the throne room of God. We used to meet as believers like this, and now it looks like this. So what we're going to begin to cover in the next few weeks is this constant foundation laying and guidance that these first century fathers of this new religion, I'm going to use that term loosely, are really trying to push the understanding of, oh my goodness, everything that we have done was a pattern to make us familiar and recognize that when the genuine real article came, this is what it would look like. And they're constantly trying to remind believers, this isn't necessarily anything new. This is a fulfillment of old things that now lead us in a new direction. So look for those things as you read through the next few weeks. Thank you for stopping by. Hope you have a great week. See you next time. Bye-bye.